Good evening, everybody. How are you?
Doing diet.
Hey, there is life. Does that mean the rest of you are actually virtual reality? Are you holograms? No word. So I guess the answer is yes. All right. Speakers, we have one person in the audience and a whole lot of holograms. So it's up to you to try and bring them to life. Let me start off by saying that my name is Dalim. I am Events Director for ISARCA London Chapter, and this is an ILC, ISARCA London Chapter event, with the kind permission of our hosts here, PWC. So thank you very much, PWC. Now, I need somebody at PWC to just inform me, and maybe this is my colleague Nikita. Could you just come to the front? Nikita is our key contact at PWC. So if you spot any gaps in the slides, Nikita. What about if we hear any bells? Which are the fire exits and all that sort of stuff?
I should have researched that, I guess.
All right. Okay, let me help you. If
You know it's better than I do, darling.
If you hear any bells, please head back to reception, which is over there, and there are fire exits over there and out onto the riverside part. Else, you can actually head over there, the back exit, which leads you out onto that street which is near London Bridge. Yeah? So those are the two exits. Nikita, keep those bells switched off. No, I don't mean that. Let's just try and make sure there aren't any. If you need toilets and things, ding, 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 ding. I know where they are, but I think you have to go through a controlled gate to get there. So, no? Past the club. Oh no, that absolutely right. The toilets that are easily accessible are out of here and sort of looping back to just over there. Male and female toilets are there. That's it. Thanks, chaps. Good. Okay, so we're all set. Let's get going. This event is, of course, a special one because you're here. So, welcome to this. And what we've got is an interesting mix of topics. You might think, GDPR. Again? Well, bad news. Now we're in the world of GDPR. Now it's up to you, up to us, to make sure it's happening and working. And now we put into practice the fact that GDPR, 25th of May, 4% fines, all that sort of stuff, wasn't just for 25th of May. It's ongoing. It's forever. Well, relatively forever. So what happens in GDPR? What are the salient aspects and features of GDPR in 2018 and onward into the future? And I think Joey, our first presenter here, is probably going to cover through till 3018, is that right, Joey? GDPR through to 38 for the next 100 years. Joey will cover that. He might feel he hasn't got enough time for that and just concentrate on the next 2 or 3 years, but we'll see. However, one very important aspect of GDPR that we do know about is this thing called DPO. What is a DPO? Does it have anything to do with Alcoholics Anonymous? May do, don't know. What is it? What do you do about it? And so on. We are extremely lucky to have Deanne here, who has set up the first global DPO service. And that's just amazing. And we're very lucky because every day, from what I can see, the numbers of people in her organization are growing, as you'd expect from an illustrious former partner of Baker McKenzie. So Deanne is a top lawyer who's taken the DPO mantle and is running with it. But our world isn't just about compliance to do with data, compliance to do with our organization, is it? We are all in a mesh of interlinked organizations, our suppliers, our customers, and so on. Our suppliers, hey, we're okay. We're A-OK as far as GDPR is concerned. We've worked hard for the last 2 years, so we jolly well ought to be. But what about our suppliers? And how do we rate our suppliers? You've got all those credit rating agencies and so on. So everybody possibly other than you, knows what your credit rating is and whether they should do business with you. Shouldn't that apply to supplier companies as well? How much can we rely on our supply chain? James, our third speaker, will cover that aspect. So that's the theme of the evening. Let me give you a few ISARCA-related slides and then we'll kick off into Joe's presentation. So this is, another representation of what I've just told you. The salient times here being that we will finish the formal part of the event by 2030, by 8:30. And then there's something called networking with food and drinks. I don't know what that is. But each time I notice that there's an incredible pent-up buzz of energy that erupts and helps itself to food and drink and so on. I don't expect this will be any different. We'll have lots of food and drink for you at that point. So what happens between now and 2030 is these three guys will present and there'll be some time for your Q&A as well. Probably with Joey's, he'll take his Q&A during his session. I'm actually going to suggest Diane and James, you do the same. Yeah? Great. Okay, so that's about this evening. What have we got for future evenings? Well, we're running into summer, of course, so not too much. But if we take it that there is something happening in June and something happening in July, here's an inkling of what there is. On this Wednesday, i.e. in 2 days' time, we've got something, ISARCA London chapter has got an event at IBM South Bank. Who's going to that? A number of people. Good. It should be really good. I do know that it's sold out, so I won't invite you to rush over there and get tickets and so on. Not unless you have keys to the IBM windows and are happy to climb in. And I'm not saying that, I'm not encouraging that. But there's going to be that event on this Wednesday. And then there is an NLB, BCS North London branch event that's publicised here, which is on Tuesday or Thursday, 5th of July. I think it's actually Thursday. But anyway, it's definitely on the 5th of July. And that will have somebody who's a familiar figure to these locations. It's Chris Potter, and Chris Potter is not only CIO for UK Assurance at PWC, as it says on the slide here, he is also a senior partner for UK Assurance with, I think, well over 2 decades of experience at PWC. So a great speaker, great guy, and he will talk about being intelligent in the digital age. So what's the common theme there? Intelligence, of course, Security Leaders Guide to Augmented Intelligence, and then being intelligent in the digital age. So do be intelligent, do sign up for both of these if you can, do come, and we'll look forward to seeing you. Okay, so that's about future events. Past events you can spot on the ISARCA website and so on. But I'm going to take a different angle on this for a moment, and that is to ask you, who is a CISA? Who has a CISA certification here? And the answer here is approximately half of us. Who has a CISM? And I acknowledge you might have both CISA and CISM. And this is the interesting statistic. The number of CISMs we've got are starting to overtake the number of CISAs. And who has a C risk? A smaller but still significant number, about 20% of us. And again, people tend to have multiple ISARCA certifications. And who's got a CGITE? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Excellent. Good. So that's the spread of major ISARCA certifications. We're hoping that others come steaming along, such as CSX, maybe such as COBIT, and others. We are also promoting a series of activities around She Leads Tech. So you'll hear more about those things in due course. But I understand ISARCA did rather well with these CISM and C-Risk certifications. Is that right, Ellis? Ellis, our marketing director. Yep. Ellis has kept something close to his chest. That's because he's been carrying his bag on his chest. But he's going to be bringing them here. Bring them over, Ellis. That's it. What are these, Ellis?
Okay, so at the SC Awards last week, ISACA won 2 awards in the UK. One was for Best Professional Training or Certification Programme, and that was for CISM. There were 4 nominations, and we also, one of the few categories actually where someone actually won highly commended as well, and we got that for our C-risk qualification. So it's great, I think, out there to see these are being recognised. Okay, sorry. Excuse the fingerprints, I just cannot keep this one clean. Okay.
Excellent. So if you're wondering where these will be after today, check out Ellis's address and they'll be on his mantelpiece. Great. Okay, so that's it really, as far as all the immediate news is concerned. Other news and opportunities, I'll ask you that question at the end of the evening. Let me now hand over to Joe.
Cheers. Thanks, Darren. Can everyone hear me okay? Yep, cool.
If you want to.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. So thanks, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about a topic that you've probably heard a lot about, GDPR. But you can be rest assured I'm not talking to you about what it is. I think you've probably heard a lot of that. But before I go into what I'm going to cover, though, I'll just give you a bit of background about myself. So I'm a partner in our technology risk practice. I've led our GDPR assurance practice that focuses on the FTSE 100 market and central government for about 12 months. But my background is kind of working in big scale transformations, system implementations, kind of governance and controls programs, as well as doing work in cyberspace. So I've got a varied background, but now leading this part of our practice. And I suppose what I wanted to talk a little bit about today was, our view of what is data privacy in a live regulatory environment, and what are some of the things that we need to be considering and thinking about. But also importantly, what are the opportunities for ourselves as practitioners to A, help our organizations, but B, kind of, accelerate and help our own careers. So talk a little bit about, what we're seeing in the market, where we're seeing different organizations be. As PWC, we've worked with hundreds of organizations now around helping either implement programs to help become GDPR compliant or do a number of review and assurance engagements. So kind of give you a bit of a feeling of where organizations are at. Talk a little bit about the drivers that we see that are changing the face of privacy going forward, around regulation, but also around a digital disruption, and organizations need to be agile in a digital world. And then finally just cover off the role for yourselves going forward in that. So to start off with what we see organizations and how they're approaching kind of data privacy. I've got a slide up here which just talks about some aspects of GDPR, but I want to kind of just bring out some of the key points and differences that we're seeing. Hopefully that resonates with yourselves and your organizations. The first is a pretty obvious one, but organizations have started this at very different stages. There's been a lot of organizations that have really turned up the heat on this at the end of 2017 or the start of 2018, versus some that have had this in their plans for a number of years. And there can be a number of factors that have driven this. Part can be regulatory environment. So some organizations that sit in more regulated environments and industries are used to this kind of stuff. Others kind of had investigations by the regulator, etc. But we are seeing a difference in terms of kind of the progression. It's also safe to say from working with a number of organizations, no one's kind of beating the chest and publicly saying we believe we are fully compliant and we've got this in hand. Everyone is starting to understand this is a real journey and something they need to keep working on. The second, I suppose, key thing that we've identified or observed is organizations have structurally taken very different approaches to try and become GDPR compliant. All of my clients, have taken very different approaches for their programs. So some have run them through legal, and often that was organizations that started this a bit earlier because they've seen this as a legal, legislative, regulatory thing they have to comply with. Some have driven it through the business. They've seen this as a real business enabler. So one organisation that I work with, they have a role on their exec called the Chief Customer Officer. And this rolls up into them. So operations, anything to do with the customer sits under them, and it's really been driven as a how do we put the customer first initiative. And a lot of organisations are also running these types of programs through IT. Often IT are seen as the drivers of transformation. Might not be the right thing. You'd hope it's driven by the business, but often IT is seen as the guys who can do projects and can drive delivery of transformation. So we're often seeing programs being led through IT. But one common aspect of programs, which I think is important to be aware of, is we're seeing the different aspects of the GDPR compliance programs within a single program, all being at different levels of maturity. So some organisations, for example, actually are at a much more mature position from a cyber perspective than they are from data privacy. Data privacy, I mean, there's previous legislations, but organisations haven't necessarily embraced that and been compliant. But cyber's been a board level issue for a while. So some organisations have pretty mature security postures around cyber, less so in data privacy. So actually some organisations are kind of grappling with how they get them both up to the same stage. Does one have to be higher than the other? So those are some of the conversations that organisations are struggling with, which I think kind of impacts the work that a number of the people in this room do. The final point is probably just around the type of work organisations are doing. We've seen a lot of organisations, particularly organisations that started relatively early, so had really good intentions. They've done a lot of busy work. They've done loads and loads of busy work, sometimes because it's a bit easier to do, but also because it's not necessarily driving the transformational change. But that hasn't really significantly reduced the risk position of that organisation. And compare that to some organisations that have come quite late to this and have to be very critical around what do we focus our time on. And some of them actually haven't necessarily done they haven't necessarily done enough to ensure the quality of what they've done. So we've got this kind of work time paradox where some organisations are doing lots of busy work without not really reducing the risk profile, but developing loads and loads of paper shield, loads and loads of documentation, which has a role and has a purpose. Others are kind of taking a different approach because of the time they have available. And actually, for ourselves, it's really kind of challenging, where is our organisation at in that? What's the right thing to do and what should we be doing post-May? Knowing where you're at in that kind of paradox. And the final thing that I'll just talk about is probably the thing that is very consistent amongst every organisation that we've worked with is the term risk-based approach. Every single client we deal with talks about it. It's interesting that I think they all have slightly different definitions, and it means different things to different people. Some are using it as a way to avoid doing things and to try and move risk around. Others are kind of embracing it in terms of what it really means, which is prioritising your risk and prioritising your activities to address your highest risk areas. But that's something that I think as practitioners we should really be challenging. What is our approach? What does risk-based approach really mean? And what does that mean for the role of IT, security, control practitioners in a post-May environment? So that's some of the kind of the key themes we're seeing. Now, hopefully that resonates with what you're all seeing in your organisations. So that's a bit about what we're seeing. If I move on to the next section, which is, what is this going forward? Our view as PWC is, and I think it's probably backed up by Diane, the fact that she's got a session on a My DPO service. But our view is that this is actually not really gonna go away. Obviously, there's transactional elements of that, which is clients and organisations have programs to complete to try and get compliant, and then also need to sustain compliance in a world where consumers and employees and citizens have more rights. So there's obviously those kind of transactional elements. But from our perspective, we see data privacy moving to a space where it's going to be embedded and involved into how businesses operate. For two reasons. One is just that organisations need to do it to stay ahead. We're seeing loads and loads of examples in the market now where, if organisations are being assessed by the market more on how they do things versus what they do, and the how in terms of community, protecting rights, etc., is really, really important. And the social consciousness of the fact that we've we've got these rights in our data means that if organizations aren't treating it appropriately, it's going to impact them, and we've seen that through the impact on share prices when there's a data breach for organizations, the press they get, etc. But also we're seeing it already in terms of how organizations operate business. I mean, I was speaking to a client last week. They gave us an RFP to effectively to help them implement a marketing e-commerce platform. And front and center of that business requirements for the RFP is all about privacy. It's all about how can we convince them that we have the specialists and expertise to make sure that when we implement this system, it's done in the right way, that they're not putting their customer data at risk, that we're considering data privacy regulation, but also in the context of their risk appetite. And we see that happening more and more. Organizations are going to be speaking to us and others around how can you help us with this as we go through transformation. So as business operates and evolves, we feel data privacy is going to be a key element and driver of that. And we're seeing it already. And there's two reasons for that. One is around regulation, but one is around the way the business world is going. So I'll touch on regulation and the evolving kind of landscape of data protection to start with, and then move on to kind of business. Some of this you probably are aware of and you've seen. Some of this, is probably, you're less aware of. I suppose the headline message from our perspective is organizations need to keep reevaluating their risk position and how they embrace the requirements of data privacy to operate as a business in the face of loads and loads and loads of change. It's not a static environment. So we're seeing, if you look at the trends in the business world over time, the world is becoming more and more regulated. Now, some industries you see it, like FS already, it's been really strong since the banking crisis. Other industries are coming into it now, but our view is that regulation's only going to ever increase, and so organizations need to be smart about how they deal with that, and not overburden themselves, but kind of embrace it. So some of these things here, so you've got the UK data protection legislation, which will be coming in. So if an organization's got a posture and a process and a program that means they're GDPR compliant, when this comes in very soon, what are the differences? How do they react to that? So that's something that they just need to keep tweaking the edges of how they embrace and how they do data privacy. Other territory legislation, a large number of my clients are multinational because I work in the FTSE 100 market. And they've made decisions that they are going to lift the maturity of data privacy and how they treat their customers to the standards of GDPR, even when they operate in markets and areas that aren't necessarily in the scope of GDPR, because they see a customer as a customer, right? Now, how do you evolve your data privacy position and what you do in the face of other legislations coming in other markets? And we expect that. We know there's loads of draft legislations around the world. So that's something that organizations need to consider and think about. The new EU e-privacy legislation, which is kind of called the cookie legislation, is kind of coming in. Publicity. So, when I was speaking to clients and organizations, particular consumer data-centric clients of mine, when some of the more recent scandals happened, they had a significant spike in subject access requests. This is pre-May 25th. So the public consciousness around this stuff is real, and actually we have a real right around asking organizations how they protect and process our data is going to continually increase as we see data breaches and other kind of things in the press. A big one is enforcement plans and actions, and effectively that whole bottom row, I suppose what our point of view on this is that because this has been very theoretical so far, now we're moving into a live environment, but so far things have been theoretical. As we move into a live environment and we see how the regulator enforces things, and are they going really hard on organizations around marketing processes or around consumer versus employee, as we see litigation and legal interpretations come through, that's all going to require organizations to think about how they tweak their position, because you've all made calls around your risk-based position, and you might want to adapt that as you see how the world is evolving, how the legislation is being interpreted, but also how the regulator is. And we see quite a big role there, and the role for people like with risk, governance, and IT backgrounds to really make sure organizations are doing this and doing this in the right way. So that's a quick whistle stop of, our view is that the legislative and the kind of evolving landscape of data protection is going to change, which means that there's going to be continuing need to kind of think this through, and is this right for your organization? The other driver of the reason why we believe that this is here to stay, and it's not a 2-year thing, it's an ongoing business operations thing, is kind of how organizations are evolving and how they have to evolve their business. So all of our view is organizations need to embrace digital disruption and need to work out how they can operate in a digital age. I mean, my organization is doing that. The biggest tech companies that do this really well are doing this as well. And if they don't, they won't exist. I mean, if you take retail as an example, you would have seen over the weekend, or you might have seen over the weekend, Pound World's going into administration. So many big brands that we're all aware of are really struggling to grapple with how do they embrace the digital age and kind of deal with your Amazons and your pure play, digital retailers. And that's something that's really important. I mean, I was speaking to someone at a big high street retail brand recently, and they were talking to me about, so they're a bricks and mortar, old school retailer, and they are thinking through what are the future business models for them, and they are not too far off a model where they potentially really challenge what's the role of the store, right? And what value do we get out of it? Do they want to be, operating in a world where their sales are through AI technology, voice recognition? So all sales are done through Echo and Alexa. There's already smart technology in fridges and other things that kind of can identify, for example, when your milk is kind of slowly reducing. Do they want to embrace a world where that drives purchases and sales, and it's all voice recognition? So if you are going to go out tonight and you need a black jacket, you kind of say what you want, and then a voice recognition will come back and say, well, you bought this jacket last month, this was the size, it's in stock here, costs £10 more than this place, that place can deliver it in 45 minutes, this one in an hour and a half, and that's the whole consumer experience. Don't have to deal with payments, don't have to deal with kind of other human beings in the store. And that's a real possibility. And actually, we're nearly there already. Retail's moving so fast. That kind of experience, all the building blocks are already in place. That's not really that revolutionary. That's not using AI technology or drones technology if you're thinking about delivery times. That actually isn't already there. So that's not that far away, but that's kind of the type of conversation that's being had. Now, if you think about a world like that, and if you're a digital retailer trying to embrace the digital age, what's the impact on data privacy? What's the impact on the rights of ourselves? Now, it's different. And the way an organization uses our data, processes our data, views us is very, very different. So as an organization evolves their business model, they absolutely have to think about this. Data privacy shouldn't be an inhibitor, but it should enable what they're trying to do. And that's quite critical. And that's kind of the change of what we're seeing, the kind of conversation we're having with organizations right now. The other big one around digital disruption is and Darren talked about it a little bit earlier around suppliers and kind of third parties, is the world has become more and more interconnected. And with the Internet of Things and digital disruption, it's only going to become more interconnected. So I'm working with a client right now, and we're helping them implement robotics into their finance shared service centers. And there's a few big-time players in the robotics space that have the market-leading robotics technology. They have to partner with them. They have to also partner with someone that can help them implement it, maybe someone else that can help assure it. And so actually, as we embrace emerging tech, no one's going to have, outside of maybe some of the really big tech players, have enough budget and headcount to have specialists that can develop all this stuff in-house. So loads more interrelationships, loads more reliance on third parties, which once again drives complexity in the data privacy world. So what is the role of data privacy, and how do you protect and secure the data of your customers or your employees? So that's quite critical. And the third element I'll just touch on around digital disruption is around data itself. So digital disruption, one of the elements of it is around kind of putting data at the heart of your organization, so you can drive better management decision making, better insights, etc. And that all leverages off, and you can leverage that position of data privacy and GDPR. So if I keep the retail example, there's a retailer that I'm talking to at the moment who's worked on putting in a GDPR compliance program. Now, if you strip GDPR back, and the lawyers will disagree with me, so I'm not going to say this, but GDPR is very complex. There's lots of elements to it, but one of the fundamental principles of it is around good data governance. It enables you to understand what is your most important data in the consumer and employee space. Where is it? How do you process it? How do you control and secure it? And if you want to drive better MI and insights to drive your business forward and actually beat your competitors, you kind of need to know where your data is to start with. So it enables MI, insights, analytics. And a lot of organizations haven't quite got that, and they're trying to do stuff on the edges, but they're not going to really change the game. So this retail I'm talking about right now is confident about where they're at in terms of what they've done around the consumer data. They want to leverage that and apply it to their product data suite, right? Because if they can get that right with product data, they can improve their supply chain, reduce costs, give the customer a better experience, etc. So digital disruption is going to really kind of give organizations an opportunity to leverage the good stuff that GDPR puts in place that you kind of need anyway into how you run your business. So that's kind of how we see the world of disruption impacting privacy. So I've talked a little bit about where organizations are at and the different stages. A bit about why we believe the regulation is going to, and kind of the environment is going to continue to make this important. But then also the fact that we believe it's fundamental to how organizations need to transform, otherwise it won't exist. So the final thing I wanted to just touch on was the role of technology. I don't know the background of every single person in this room, but it's probably safe to say there's a mix of technology, information systems, security, risk, governance. So kind of my background, what I've done in my career, I think will probably a large part of resonate to people here. And I think there's a huge opportunity for us, to kind of hold our organizations to account, make sure we're delivering real value, but also to kind of, use this as an opportunity to kind of accelerate our careers and make sure that we're really relevant and valuable to our organizations. So I've got some bullets up here in terms of some of the tangible areas that tech can help, and consider the area of risk. But 3 areas I want to touch on. One is around supporting remediation. Now that's a significant role. Some organizations are really not far down the path of GDPR compliance, and they're getting to the stage now of how do we remediate our environment. That could be, just even for some big organizations, just the approach and to implement and, for example, encrypt all their key servers and sustain that can be a significant transformation program. So there's quite a big role for technology to play. And actually, if technology put their hand up and say, we need to be a really big player in remediating the situation that we have right now. But also in sustaining compliance, remediating issues. So for example, if a subject access request comes in and the data treatment that the organization decides is around deletion or encryption, what's the role of IT? So there's quite a big role to play. The second's around disruption. I talked a little bit about business disruption. Tech's got a really big role to play in that, but also disruption in GDPR compliance. So PWC has, for example, a proposition around how you use natural language processing, AI and robotics to automate your subject access request process. So embracing tech to drive automation in how you comply can reduce the cost of compliance but improve accuracy. So there's a role there for technology to really drive that agenda and be really challenging. And hang on, we're already investing in this robotics and AI platform for finance back office. We absolutely should leverage this for data privacy. And the final area is around sustaining compliance. So I've got a 2-minute video which I'll play now, but knowing that people in this room are probably governance, controls, IT specialists. I think there's a big role to play around the second line defense. What's the role for yourselves around helping sustain compliance? Now, GRC technology platforms have been around for a very long time. And so I want to play a video of what our one is, not as a sales pitch, just to give you an understanding of what is out there and what you could be really driving the conversation in your organization around how you kind of move the dial around helping support and sustain compliance, supporting the legal functions and the other functions. So let me now see if this works, untested.
The General Data Protection Regulation, enforced from May 2018, is the biggest change to data protection for 20 years. It introduces new requirements which are complex to evidence when you have multiple activities running in parallel. Privacy IQ allows you to control and monitor your compliance activities centrally and evidence it in a simple way. It acts as a repository to support you in demonstrating accountability as required by the GDPR. First, you need to know what personal data you hold, how you are using it, and why you use it. You need to capture your data protection risks and the controls you have in place to mitigate them. You can then document your control testing to ensure that they're operating effectively and identify which controls need attention. You need to understand your compliance gaps and design a program with activities which will bridge those gaps. The GDPR requires you to carry out a number of day-to-day processes. These need to be completed in a set time frame, closely monitored and evidenced. Privacy IQ helps these processes to operate effectively, to ensure the right steps are completed in the right order and approved by the right people. Privacy IQ allows you to easily monitor activities from one place without digging through countless emails and status updates, producing quick and clear reporting that can be shared with regulators or other third parties. PWC's Privacy IQ, your mission control for intelligent data protection compliance.
So that's an example. The reason why I played that video versus versus anything else was I thought that would be very close to probably some of the stuff that you guys as governance technology practitioners do on a day-to-day basis. And I think there's an opportunity for us to really kind of push the dial on saying to the business, how do you leverage technology, insights, reporting to make sure we get a handle on this thing? So I think there's a role for us to play. So that's kind of what I wanted to cover off today. So, I've talked a little bit about where organizations are at, and they're at different stages. Our view in terms of why this is relevant going forward from a regulation, but also just a fundamental business need perspective. And then hopefully touch a little bit on kind of the role that yourselves can play, and to help your organizations, but hopefully also kind of, help your own career, so to speak.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Joey.
Cheers.
Stick around here.
Yeah.
So the next speaker is Deanne of Hewitt Mills. She's the CEO of the first global DPO service. Deanne, what do you mean the first global DPO service? And who needs a DPO anyway?
Very good questions, and I hope to cover those in the session. Just to say a little bit about myself. Firstly, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak about DPOs, obviously a subject that I'm incredibly passionate about. So I have been a DPO. This is almost like, DPO Anonymous. Raise your hands if you've been a DPO. In fact, anyone in the audience who's currently acting as a DPO? So a few colleagues know exactly what I'm going to be speaking to, and perhaps you can chip in as you wish. So I have been a DPO in a multinational organisation, actually acting as a DPO without knowing it. Just being recruited into a role, sole privacy counsel, and I was told by the CPO at the time, I do America, you do the rest of the world. And that meant, privacy questions coming at me from IT, from HR, from compliance. And very soon I sort of recognized that they were my army, actually. They were people whom I could actually engage with to help me drive compliance and privacy compliance within the organization. So I've been a DPO, also acted very recently, as Dallin was mentioning, as a partner. So I headed up the data protection and cybersecurity practice of the London office of Baker McKenzie. So that was a very interesting transition, going from in-house, in the weeds, actually answering questions about how to implement the law, which is a very different position to be in, because you're then looking at, how do you operationalize policy rather than drafting policy and handing that over to a client. And actually that was a very useful background and experience to have before going into the private practice role, where I was doing the sort of the policy drafting and the agreement drafting. And so I was having, a very jolly time doing that. In fact, I picked the right time to move to Baker McKenzie, and I remember very vividly my first day, because literally on that day, the safe harbour decision was declared invalid. So prior to starting at Baker McKenzie, I had to put this sort of business case together as to, what I was going to do. And I said, I have an inkling that this area is going to really take off. And so, a few, I'm sure, but, it's data. And of course, just come in and see what you can do. And of course, first day, safe harbour invalid. We had lots of queries from companies across the world about how to fix the gap that had suddenly erupted. And then, we had the Privacy Shield decision, and then whilst we're getting our heads around that, GDPR was then finally passed, so we knew it was coming into force in 2 years' time. There was so much that was happening all at once. So absolutely pick the right time to be a partner. And if I do say so myself, I think I have now got quite a good sense of where data protection is going and where the action actually is going to be. And so towards the end of last year, a number of things were happening. I was supporting these large multinationals. We were going through the GDPR program, and we kept getting stuck on this one issue, which was the DPO. Exactly who was going to perform that role? Was it somebody who could do the role internally? But actually they were all very short of resources, so they didn't want to move their lawyers into the DPO role because they wanted the lawyers to do the lawyering. Were they going to recruit somebody externally? Well, actually the challenge is that, there was a shortage, for one, of individuals who had deep domain expertise and extensive experience in data privacy, because these organizations that I was supporting, actually they had very complex privacy issues. And so having somebody who was newly qualified in the area would be such a huge responsibility if they were called upon to interface with a regulator if this organization had a breach or had a complaint. So there's that issue of shortage, and also potentially appointing very junior people in the role. You have the same issue. Appoint a junior person, they'll grow into it. But actually, if you face a breach, your reputation is at stake, and you want somebody who's able to defend you quite robustly. So it was a combination of all those things. And actually, I thought, what role will allow me to combine that sort of internal experience that I've had, the legal experience that I've had delivering services, and it's going to be at the heart of, the action. And, it became very clear to me that there was a real need for a DPO service. And so I've taken the best of what I've learnt from working in these multinational, complex organizations that require support globally on issues of data. Also, the law firm model, and Baker McKenzie was a very good example of operating globally and being able to support clients globally on all sorts of legal issues. Obviously, I was doing it on data protection, but I worked very closely with colleagues across Europe, and I worked very closely with colleagues in APAC and colleagues in the Americas. And so in setting up this DPO service, I very much had that global outreach in mind. So we opened our first office in London, opposite the Old Bailey, and then very quickly opened an office in Dublin. And we've got representatives in APAC, representatives in Africa, representatives in the Americas, and we're very much already supporting clients globally as an outsourced DPO service. So we act as the DPO, and also we support in advising internal DPOs. So if they want a team to help them in their sort of decision making, when they're actually filling in the DPIAs, they want a second opinion, we also do that. So I'm going to speak in a little bit more detail about what exactly has changed I'm going to talk about when is a DPO required, what we actually do, so what's the day-to-day work of a DPO. I've touched upon some of the items that I cover. A very important point, which again sometimes can be lost in an organisation, is this idea of being independent and not being subject to influence by the organisation in your decision making. The issue of whether you should have an internal or an external DPO, and then how much money should you be giving your DPO? What's the budget? And what's the impact if you don't give your DPO enough money to actually do their role? And then I'm going to explain a little bit about how DPOs are perceived, and I can see that changing also. And then obviously the impact of non-compliance. What happens if you don't get it right? You don't appoint when you are supposed to appoint, or you appoint and then you try and influence, or you try and keep your DPO in a box and not tell them everything. So what's the consequence of doing all of that? Okay, so in terms of what's changed then, well, the data protection officer is mandated in certain circumstances, and then the Article 29 Working Party, which is the group of all the regulators represented across Europe, have also recommended it in others. So they say, well, it may be the law in these circumstances to absolutely have one, but you might also want to think about, even if you don't have a legal obligation to appoint a DPO, actually appointing one anyway. Okay, so in terms of when a DPO is actually required, mandated by law, well, the relevant provision is Article 37 in the GDPR, and it focuses on what's an organisation's core activity. So if your core activity involves the regular and systematic monitoring of data subjects on a large scale, then you have to appoint a DPO. And there are certain groups, if you like, or categories of organisations that will absolutely fall into this bucket. Any thoughts of a type of organisation that is systematically monitoring the behaviour of individuals? Clue? Come on, Retail companies, of course. You've kind of purchased something, you've got a store card, that information is tracked, isn't it? They want to offer you the best experience, so they'll be monitoring on a large scale activities. Facebook, someone said, yeah, social media companies, right? They're tracking your behavior on a large scale. How many individuals now are signed up to LinkedIn, to Facebook, to Instagram? We're all in an Insta world now. So yes, they're absolutely tracking your behavior, monitoring it on a large scale. Banks, financial institutions, insurers, right? They're all tracking, monitoring behavior on a large scale. They have to. Okay, so they'll fall into that category. There's some organizations not very sure because maybe their core activity isn't that. So I had a tech company who said, actually, the majority of our business is B2B, we don't monitor, but we have got one organization, one business within our big group that does a bit of profiling. We do some funky direct marketing. We've got all these innovative technologies that allow tracking using cookies and other technologies. So do we fit into that core bucket? And so we had to do some analysis, and then we had to document whether we felt that they definitely did or didn't. And if we felt that they didn't have an obligation, then that had to be signed off by a senior person within the organization. And you know what's going to happen, right? So if you decide, ooh, we're in the grey, we think we won't appoint a DPO. If there is a complaint or there's a breach, then the regulator will want to see that analysis. It's all part of this sort of accountability. So what I'm finding increasingly is that organisations that are in the grey are thinking, actually, there's benefit in appointing one anyway, rather than taking the risk. So regular systematic monitoring. Also, if you're processing on a large scale, special categories of information. So there's all the sort of information that can be used to discriminate. So if it's, health data, data about ethnicity, any information about criminal records, then yes, you'll be under this mandatory obligation to appoint a DPO. So all the healthcare providers, are under a mandatory obligation to appoint a DPO. So yes, I've given a bit more explanation on what all of that means. I've touched upon it. There's a bit of a question mark around large scale because the regulation is not prescriptive about that. And so I think, some of the guidance around this is think about how many data subjects are impacted and perhaps across Europe in particular, and think of how long. Is it a one-off activity or is it ongoing? And yes, the geographies of individuals involved. And there you can start to assess and understand whether you're in that large-scale bucket. And again, in terms of what's regular, what's systematic, and what's monitoring. And sometimes through your marketing activities, you might find yourself actually increasingly getting closer to that definition of regular, systematic monitoring. Wanting to profile individuals to give that sort of customer experience. We've got a number of clients in the hotel, airline business, increasingly wanting to understand what's the preference of Mr. X and Mrs. Y. And again, falling under that sort of bucket of monitoring in a systematic way. So the Article 29 Working Party, I mentioned that, they've given some examples of sectors definitely caught by this. So if you're working in telecommunications, yep, you'll have a mandatory obligation. Email retargeting, any data-driven activities. I mentioned profiling, location tracking. So using mobile apps, so geolocation, absolutely caught, have an obligation. Loyalty programs, increasingly organisations from all sectors want to sort of attract and retain their customers, and they do so through loyalty programs. Anyone got a Fitbit or wearing a Fitbit at the moment, or other, wearable fitness app? They will have an obligation to appoint a DPO in that sort of organisation. So even across Europe, you need to understand the various nuances and what the other regulators are saying around the appointment of a DPO. And interestingly, insurance and banks have been sort of the focus for regulators. The CNIL have said definitely if you're in that sector, you have a mandatory obligation to appoint a DPO. And Luxembourg's regulator has said something very similar as well because of the need to track accounts and transactions. So even if you don't have a mandatory obligation to appoint, should you be appointing a DPO on a voluntary basis? And, I have many clients say, well, why would you, appoint a DPO if you don't have to? There's so many obligations under the GDPR that we're trying to get our arms around. Why should we be doing something that we actually don't have a legal obligation to do? So I mentioned that the regulators, the group of regulators, the Article 29 Working Party have said, well, we recommend it, okay? Because there are a number of reasons why you would want to have one. If you want effective data governance in your organisation, if you want to build data trust in your organisation, if you want to have a vital link with the regulators, and you need to have that. If you want to have an independent assessor of the privacy rights of individuals, then we would recommend that you appoint on a voluntary basis. And if you do appoint one, the full rights and obligations will apply. So you can't say, well, because this was voluntary, we don't quite have to comply with all the obligations. That's made very clear, because that could lead to confusion, couldn't it, of the consumers and your employees. You have somebody who's ostensibly a DPO, but actually they're not fully acting as a DPO. So the legislators have said, if you call it a DPO, they are a DPO and the full rights apply. So interestingly, one of the early experiences I had when advising a client around this, they were B2B, they weren't systematically monitoring, they weren't handling large volumes of sensitive or special categories of data, and they said categorically, we're not appointing, we're far too busy, we're not going to appoint a DPO. And then it was the Privacy Council who said, hang on, let's think about this. Let's think about the customers that we support. And actually they happen to support a lot of government agencies and public bodies. And the procurement team then perked up and they said, well, actually, as part of the RFP, a question that we're asked often is, who's our DPO? And if we're answering no DPO to that question, that could actually put us at a disadvantage compared to our competitors. So they moved, actually, in the course of the discussion from definitely not to we definitely must appoint a DPO, and thinking about whether they should appoint somebody internally within the organisation or outsource that function. So what's the role of a DPO then? Well, again, there's a very high level description of what a DPO should be doing within the GDPR. And certainly a DPO has an obligation to cooperate with the supervisory authority. So we're part internal regulator within an organisation, but we also have an education responsibility to educate the organisation and their employees about how they process and what they should be doing in terms of processing data. And we also have an ongoing obligation to monitor compliance within an organisation and to report on how an organisation is doing in terms of its compliance. So we spend a lot of time advising on data protection impact assessments, and we are increasingly speaking with internal audit teams to help them audit and monitor compliance, and also spending a huge amount of time training and raising awareness of the obligation. So in doing all of this, we need to be able to act without any conflict or any undue influence from the organisation. So what is the position? What's the DPO's position within the organisation? Are we first line? Are we second line? Are we third line? There's been lots of debate around this issue. And so we can have other tasks. So in particular, when a company appoints a DPO internally, they may be also a compliance officer, or they may have certain COSEC responsibilities. That's quite possible. They can sit under legal, they can sit under risk, they can sit under compliance. So you may be called to act as, DPOs within the organisations in which you work if you're in any of those functions, and that's fine. But what you cannot be doing is making decisions and then marking your own homework. So I think if you are sort of head of HR or head of IT, it's increasingly difficult to say, well, you have got that independence and you can act as a DPO, depending on how your role works. So if, for example, it's really commercially beneficial to export all your customer and employee data outside of Europe to a third country, say China or Russia or South Africa or America, it's commercially advantageous to outsource your data, export it out. You as a head of IT or as the CFO, that would be a very attractive decision. You can't then make that decision and then say, oh, I'm now going to act as a DPO and say that was a really good idea. So you need an independent view of what the risks are and how that's been mitigated, and generally only an independent DPO can provide that insight to you. And because of the pressure that we are under, the legislation offers us protection, as a DPO. You cannot be held responsible for breaches that the company may experience, because ultimately the company is the data controller and they are responsible. So you cannot also be penalised for doing your job. In fact, you have, as an employed DPO, special protection under employment law. Because if you're penalised, that could lead to a whistleblowing claim against an organisation, right? Of course, if you're not doing your job and you're not performing as a DPO, that's an entirely different position. But you have to be involved in a timely way in the decision-making of an organisation, and you have to be given enough money to do the job. Sounding quite attractive, isn't it? Protected employment rights, given enough resources, can't be fired for doing your job. You have to be independent of management. You have to be sufficiently autonomous. And the assessment is one that has to be done practically, concretely, and according to a company's organisation. So we're spending a lot of time looking at companies' corporate governance to see how we can ensure that objectively the DPO has that independence. So one of the key questions then is, do you appoint somebody internally or do you outsource that responsibility to a third party, to an organisation? So we're going to think about some of the advantages and disadvantages of that. Of course, it's possible to have a DPO appointed internally, but it's really important to also know that that internal appointment has an obligation towards the supervisory authority. So they're partly responsible for reporting any breaches that present high risk to individuals to the supervisory authority across Europe in the jurisdictions in which you have operations. The GDPR allows for an internal or external appointment, and I talked about the fact that whatever role the DPO has internally, it needs to be complementary and compatible with their professional duties. It's possible to outsource the DPO role, and certainly if you did that, you'd need to think about whether your outsource provider has knowledge of your sector, your industry, and it's easy to, I guess, demonstrate the independence when the position is outsourced. And certainly I look at the outsourced position as a DPO office, so a blend of individuals rather than one single individual. Anyone working in an organisation that operates outside of Europe, so internationally? Few hands raised. It's also really important to understand the international dimension if you are working in those types of organisations, because, I mean, the recommendation from the European regulators is that the DPO should sit in Europe because they should be accessible to European data subjects. And you might say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? It's Europe, taking its own sort of protectionist stance, as typical. However, it is possible to sit outside of Europe as a DPO. Absolutely possible. There's no bar under the law. But the important thing is you must ensure that you are accessible. So we've had discussions with organisations where the DPO is sitting in the US. As we know, if there is a data breach, there's a very tight time frame in which you have to report a data breach. So it's important to ensure that the DPO can respond and react very quickly. It's possible for a group to appoint a single DPO, and one way of dealing with the accessibility requirement is that they can have privacy champions across the group who support them. Can a chief privacy officer also act as a DPO? And again, so the chief privacy officer often sits on the board. They may have shares in the company, and you have to think about, can they act independently if there's a decision to not use a data set because the organisation is not sure of how that data set was obtained, and that could mean an impact on the bottom line? Is it possible for a CPO to make that very tough decision, knowing that that might impact their profitability? So, so you need to think about the implications of that. Also need to think about local laws and how they may potentially impact the DPO role. So in Germany, if you have an organisation employing 10 people or more, there's an obligation to appoint a DPO. So the threshold is so much higher in Germany. So you need to think about how your organisation is placed. And again, the French supervisory authority, the CNIL, also recommends that a DPO is appointed even when there isn't a legal obligation to appoint one. So member states can vary the obligation, and if you work and operate across a number of European jurisdictions, you need to think about what that means. We're getting lots of questions from organisations who have a DPO appointed in the UK, because they're saying, well, what happens when Brexit happens? Because the UK is then outside of the EU, the EA, and does that mean that we then have to appoint another DPO inside of the EEA? So again, it would be the same situation as this if you had your DPO appointed in the US, or if you had your DPO appointed in APAC. You'd need to think about having a representative in the other European jurisdictions. How much money should you give your DPO? And if you don't resource your DPO adequately, could that potentially lead to a complaint to the supervisory authorities? We're having lots of questions and debates, healthy debates about this, because obviously the DPO role for many organisations is so new. They don't know what level of demand there's going to be on the DPO. And so really struggling at a time where they've had huge budgets to actually implement GDPR programs. They now need to find another line item for the DPO. And thinking about also the size of team that the DPO needs, and whether they'll also want external support, much in the way that a legal team may go to outside counsel. The DPO wants to have that available to them as well. We're starting to see a change around how DPOs are perceived. I think initially there was a lot of suspicion around the DPO, and I think it's partly because the DPO had this obligation to report non-compliance to the supervisory authorities. So there was a lot of nervousness, especially for organisations that weren't very far forward in their GDPR programs. And they thought, oh, the DPO comes in, they're going to see all our gaps, they're going to see all our skeletons, they're going to go running to the supervisory authority. How would we cope with all of that? But increasingly, I think, as organisations mature, as they get comfortable that they've done enough to be in a reasonable and defensible position, they're starting to welcome the DPO. And increasingly see having a DPO as something that's advantageous, an objective, second pair of eyes on what's being done, and to help organisations with risk management. Very important, because what happens if you get it wrong? We know that there are quite significant fines, but there's a reputational damage, obviously, to brand. And what we're starting to see develop is this idea of privacy litigation. So, individuals who perhaps have been sent marketing when they've objected to receiving marketing, and they've tried to get off the list and keep receiving marketing, and bringing small claims against organisations, and we might see other types of litigation emerge. You're having a DPO in place who's reviewed your program, who's advised you objectively on what you need to do, is good mitigation. So in terms of the office then, and how I see the future of the DPO provision, I've mentioned that I don't think this role for large, complex organisations, and also organisations that may not be so large but might be doing very high risk activities. So we talked about monitoring of individuals. I think it's very difficult to just have one person act in that role, and I increasingly see it as a role of an office, and that's absolutely how we have set ourselves up. So you have there array of the individuals who support me in providing this outsourced offering, and absolutely need to have experience in a number of different sectors, so technology, retail, hospitality, financial services, legal. We have individuals who've been auditors, individuals who barristers, who are solicitors, who have cyber and tech specialisms, and we call upon all of those backgrounds and experience when we are providing support. I think that the DPO is this sort of mystical, magical creature, you know, just part lawyer, part IT person, part auditor, part regulator. You know, if you've had experience in any of the supervisory authorities, it's always really helpful. And it is a difficult role to achieve in just one person. So absolutely, you have to have a good understanding of privacy legislation such as GDPR, but it was mentioned earlier, what about e-privacy? So if you've got yourself comfortable with GDPR, does that mean that you're going to be compliant with e-privacy? The answer is no. It's a very different piece of legislation. Like, they interface with each other, but they deal with very different things. And I think there's been a lot of confusion actually on the market around GDPR and e-privacy. You know, all those re-consent emails that we got, you know, that actually was trying to deal with an e-privacy issue that organisations hadn't been compliant with obtaining consent from individuals to direct market to them. And then the GDPR sets a higher standard of consent. So, you know, organisations recognised that they hadn't kept the audit trail, that perhaps had never had our consent in the first place. They now have to achieve a higher standard of consent, and that was what they were seeking to get. But you know, we know that the e-privacy is going to have a huge impact on many organisations that are communicating online, that are using cookie technologies, that are engaged in profiling activities and other activities. So we, as a DPO service, we certainly need to keep abreast of that, abreast of all the technologies that were mentioned earlier: blockchain, AI, cloud. They all have this impact on data, and increasingly you're asked, can we do this? Is this lawful, and is it ethical? So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Well, let's move on to our third presenter, and this is James, and I'm going to ask him, James, you're going to be talking about third parties, about suppliers and so on. I wonder, have you done any ratings yet on DPO organizations?
Good question. Good question. Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is James Warriner. I work for BitSite, which is a cybersecurity ratings company. Hands up if you've heard of cybersecurity ratings. All right, a couple of you heard of it. Good, good, good. Well, as you can tell, I've been around the block a little bit of time. I can see you shaking your heads. But I actually I started off my career in safety critical systems and working for an avionics company. So I helped do the test kits for the Airbus A320, which was the first one, which is a bit of a time ago, so I have been around a little bit. But lastly, I've been working in cybersecurity. I joined BitSite because I heard this term, cybersecurity ratings. I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder what that is about. And how do people get ratings? How can you get that information? And how can you use that information? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a little bit of this information now about cybersecurity ratings and how they can be used and how they are being used by organizations. So to start with, just to set the context for this for everybody in the room, obviously we've talked a little bit about breaches. We talked a little bit about the reason why regulation has come in and why regulation is putting pressure on. But the reality is we're still as weak, basically we're only as strong as our weakest link, right? We all know that in this room. So one of our jobs to do, one of the things we have to do is identify where we're the weakest. This is the way that we will protect our companies from the inevitable consequences, right, of breaches. Whether that is in financial losses, reputational loss, whether our CEO gets canned, right? And this is why it's moving very quickly from the back room to the boardroom. Remember when I joined in cybersecurity, this was something that, people used to say, oh, what intrusion protection system are you using, right? What are your firewalls like? Now the conversations are about operational risk. And that's a damn good thing for all of us, right? because we're thinking about what is the consequence of some of these things as a result of us holding this data. But the reality is that the stakeholders being involved in these discussions are very different from those that were discussing cybersecurity before. And this is an issue. This raises a lot of questions, right? Questions in the boardroom are now things like, well, how do I know I'm improving? No, seriously, how do I know that I'm improving? What are my competition doing? How am I relative to them? If any of you in this room have run a business, right, and I know a few of us have, right, one of the things that keep us awake at night is what is my competition doing? So when someone comes into my room and says to me, are you spending enough, I don't think you're spending enough on cybersecurity. What do you think the first initial reaction from somebody running a company is when someone says that? What do you mean not enough? I'm already giving a load of money to spend on cybersecurity. What do you mean not enough, right? And this is one of the challenges that cybersecurity professionals have when they talk to the board, when they talk about the initiatives they want to deploy. So how do we support that kind of decision right at the top of the organization? So there are people like, for example, I was talking to a group CISO of a large services company, right? They have 86 different sites around the world, and there will be 100 soon. Each one operates completely independently with their own IT infrastructure. The job of the group CISO is to tell the board how these organizations are working. He sends out questionnaires to every single one of those organizations. They come back, the questionnaires come back, they're all completed, very good. Over 80% conformance to policies for that company. He then did a quality control on 4 of the reports. On 4 of the reports. He can only afford to do a deep dive quality control on 4 of them. The average of those 4 dropped to 20% for compliance to policy. So when you look about the sort of people who are asking for the information that they need to make decisions about where do we invest resource to make sure that our companies are more protected, it is not a straightforward question to answer. We have marketing companies, in terms of cybersecurity ratings, marketing companies say to us, we want to use, and indeed companies are using the ratings, and we talked about, and you mentioned this in terms of competitive positioning, are using ratings now because they want to inform their customers about how seriously they're taking cybersecurity and the protection of data. This is a really good point raised about us using this information. So you've got marketing now involved, saying, how do I use our cybersecurity posture to strengthen our argument to customers about buying from us? Of course, you've got the finance team, you've got legal teams involved. And if you walk into a room and say, look, we've got this intelligent firewall, it's going to be a challenge for people to understand what that actually means to the business. So this is the context. So the reason that cybersecurity came about was because people wanted to visualize and prioritize and act in a way that reflected the risk to the organization. And as I said to you, the thing about risk is it's a relative thing, isn't it? We all know that. Risk is a relative thing, right? In terms of different types of risks and the fact that different organizations will have different levels of risk that they're comfortable with and different levels of risks that they'll be able to cope with. So how do we start looking at those risks and be able to communicate them? That's where cybersecurity ratings comes in. So you can imagine the cybersecurity rating, right? In this case, I'm just looking at one type of cybersecurity rating, the one that but there are other types, but let's just concentrate on the one that I know about, which is, it goes from 250 to 900. It's a relative rating. So every organization in this room, I imagine you're representing reasonable sized organizations, most of you, has a rating, okay? Has a cybersecurity rating. And it'll go from 250 to 900. The bottom basic is the bottom 20% of all companies rated. The next 40% is in intermediate, and the top 40% are on the advanced category, okay? So it's a relative rating. It means it's a standardized rating where you can compare any 2 companies in the world. Now this is important because suddenly you can start to make decisions based on relativity and on a standardized metric, which is incredibly difficult to do in other ways. So the idea is it's continuous monitoring as well. It's daily updated. So the idea of a rating is it's daily updated. So it's very similar to the way that if you get a mobile phone and you go to Telefonica or you go to O2 and you say, I want to get a mobile phone on a contract, they immediately go to a financial ratings agency. They'll get your rating, and that will determine how likely it is you're going to pay. That's fundamentally what a rating from a finance point. How likely are you going to pay me back? And I will make a decision on whether I let you have this mobile phone contract on that basis. Well, now we have a rating that we can use as professionals to say, will I trust you with my data or not? Because that's what our rating tells you the probability that you will breach. And I'll talk about that in a second. But just to give you a highlight on that, if you are below 500 on this scale, you are about 5 times more likely to suffer a publicly disclosed breach than if you're over 700. And that's a statistical fact. So 7 out of the top 10 cyber insurers are using the rating I'm talking about here, because that has been proved by an independent company, AIR and Advisen, who are intelligence agencies for cyber insurance companies. So the fact is they're using it because it links directly to breach risk. So of course the question you may ask now is, well, how on earth do you get this information? We do not talk to companies, so obviously it needs to be completely independent. That's another word that's been used a lot today. It has to be completely independent. So we cannot talk to a company about their rating. We cannot use any subjective information. We can only use information that we can verify independently. So how do we do that? Well, just to give you a very quick overview, we collect 80 billion events a day from the internet. We're very fortunate the internet is an open and publicly accessible platform. So we collect 80 billion events every day from the internet from 120 service providers. We have our own infrastructure in there which detects botnets. So if you, and I know no one in this room would ever download a movie or a TV series from BitTorrent, but if you did, then 40%, about 40% I think it is, around that, in the process of downloading or when you get it, you will be installing a botnet. And that's how you're paying. If you're not paying with money, you're paying with a compromised system. When you do that, the botnet will reach out to a command and control server because it doesn't know where it is. It needs to find the hacker that tells it what to do. We intercept more of that traffic than any other company in the world. So that gives us a very good baseline as one of our vectors of information, which I'll show you in a second. So 80 billion events a day. Those events have IP addresses in them, right? They say where they're going from and to. And as a result of that, if we can map your company's IP address range, which by the way are in the internet registries, then of course if we've been collecting this data for 7 years, 80 billion from the internet, if we can then map down onto your company, we know which events are associated with you. So all we need to do is grade these events on whether they're good behavior or bad behavior, whether they're good risk or bad risk. And we can do that by looking at the number of breaches from groups of companies in our database. So if this type of vector of information correlates highly with that group of companies that are breaching more or have had more breaches, then we know that's a high risk vector. And that's exactly why the insurance companies are using us for cyber risk, for cyber insurance. So we filter and process that information. We put it in some vectors, which I'm going to show you, because I'm going to show you a use case of this platform very quickly. And then we calculate the rating. So that's fundamentally how we do it. All external data, all the data we have has to be verified independently, and then we use that for the rating. So how's it used? So what would you do with this data? Well, as Dan says, one of the most important uses for this data is vendor risk management. Because as I said with that story with the group CISO, the challenge with the questionnaires is it is hard to rely on all the information. If you ask me if my nieces and nephews are the most intelligent people in the world, my answer is absolutely yes. Is there some bias in that answer? Yeah, probably quite a bit of bias. So the point is that questionnaires have absolute use and they must be used. But as you know, we need to find ways of triangulating data to verify the information that we're gathering. And this is one of the reasons why ratings are being used so successfully. I was talking, again, so a couple of points of fact here about why ratings are being used. So talking to a very large organization, a very large financial organization, they had 2,500 questionnaires that they had not had the time to go through. How are they going to triage which ones are the most highest priority for them that represent the biggest risk? Another CPO saying to me, a chief procurement officer saying to me, the trouble is that when he gets back the audits from going to visit companies, on-site audits, I mean, it's the same for telephone-based audits, they would come back vanilla. They would carry out the same questions to the same companies, irrespective of their relative risks. How can he start to shape the way in which you start doing an audit again, ratings can help you with that. So vendor risk is the biggest, but of course benchmarking. I was in a meeting with a very large company, and fortunately, and this is $1 billion revenue company, it's a UK company, but they walked in, so I was in there with the head of cyber, and the CEO walked in, just by chance, and the head of cyber said, tell the CEO a little bit about what you do, James. So I said, well, who are your competitors? Which are the people that you think about all the time? Would you like to see a benchmark with 20, your 20, some of the competitors you talked about, some of your suppliers with 22 risk vectors, where I can show you red, green, and amber compared to your own relative score and you're rated on that. So he said, I'd like that in the boardroom next 2 weeks, please. Because for him as a CEO, suddenly he's getting a perspective of what am I relative to my competition. And of course, for him, that brings the whole thing up to the board level and the governance level, because he's comparing directly with others. I mean, most CEOs, having run a company myself, if you walk in my room and say, you've got to do it because it's regulated, obviously I'm going to do it. If you say you've got a big ROI, give me 1,000, I'll give you £2,000 back, of course I'm going to do it. But the third one is competitively. What is my competitive position going to be in terms of sustainable competitive advantage? So that's a critical part, and showing people where the CEO and the board, very, very important. Just to give you one piece of information again to strengthen your view here that this is becoming a very important subject. For the first time, the feed that we produce is going in, IHS Markit are taking that feed as a signal for functional trading on 3,000 companies. Now this is interesting. This really brings cyber to the forefront, doesn't it? So you can imagine this is a functional trading algorithm that is taking a cybersecurity feed to make trades. Now, if you think the chairman of those companies and the CEOs would be interested in that, well, they're starting to bring it right up into that area. And so the focus on protecting data is just going to grow and grow and grow. So let me show you a quick, so just two other, I mentioned cyber insurance, 7 out of the top 10 cyber insurers already use us. So if you go to them for a premium, the first thing they do is pull your rating to have a look at it, and you'll see that. And then mergers and acquisitions, of course, if you're going to buy a company, it's get their rating. Have a good look in it. Does it fit within your profile, your appetite? What are you going to have to do to bring them up to your own rating? Anyway, let's look at a quick, because it's one thing to talk about, it's one thing to show it. So here's a use case. So imagine I'm going to onboard a new vendor. Right? What can I do? Well, this is just the screen. It's a SaaS-based portal. I'm just showing you a SaaS-based portal, and this is just a use case, right? But say I'm going to onboard a new vendor. What I can do is you can see in the search bar there that I'm searching for a company, SAPE. It's just a demo company. Okay, I'm going to put it up, putting up a demonstration company. So when I do that, it's going to pull up for me all of the companies with that part of the name that is currently being rated. We're rating 110,000 companies, and we add about 500 companies a week. Those 500 companies are from requests from customers and prospects to be rated. By the way, if you don't find a company, it takes about 3 or 5 days for us to map the company onto our data. So pretty much very quickly. So as soon as you get this view, you can see immediately some interesting information. You can see how many people have requested this rating before, and you can also see how many companies are actively monitoring this company right now. Because remember, it's a continuous monitoring. And of course, cyber changes every single day. So you can see, and you can set alerts around the posture for a company against our ratings if it changes over time. So you can see how many people have requested this company and how many are actively rating it. As I said, if you don't find the company you want, you just type in the domain name of the company, and we will map it onto our data in 3 to 5 days. When you found the company, this is the information you will get every time, because we've been collecting for 7 years. So you might think, well, why, if you map the company now, can you still see a year back? We've got the data. The data has been coming from the internet. We've been collecting it for 7 years. So all we're doing is mapping onto our existing database by mapping a company's IP address range, domain names onto this data. So immediately you'll be able to get a view of the posture of this company over time. You'll be able to see any significant drops and some explanation behind them. You'll be able to see how that compares to that industry range. And of course, you can make comparisons with individual companies as well. These are the 22 vectors that we measure. So you'll see they're grouped into basically compromised systems, diligence, user behavior, and other. So we've got breach events. If you have a breach, it will significantly affect your rating. So again, some companies will use this for offboarding. So when you offboard a vendor, they retain data for a set amount of time. How do you know whether that data has been breached? So one of the things that we do for some companies is when after they've offboarded, we set up an alert service which allows them to see, because of course we're collecting breach information all the time. It's one of our big jobs to do. We have a big team associated with that to collect all the breach events data from the world so that we publicly disclose breaches this is, so that we can make sure we can provide that to our customers. We also provide a remediation strategy because once let's say you've highlighted to a vendor, you've got a break in the policy. If you've got a problem with the policy, then it doesn't fit with your policy, what do? Well, you can see exactly where they've got a problem inside from a risk perspective. You can then send them a report through an EVA and they can use this to remediate because we show them where they actually can improve their rating. And this is true for yourself as well if you're looking at own rating. So we give you the chance to look at that rating and develop that from there. So if you click, for example, if we were to click on open ports, we will see the actual information that's related to open ports. So you can see here, we've got a number of different open ports that we would rate as bad, that are poor, and will reduce the rating. And you can see here that that those are listed here. Note that you'll only see the IP address if it's your own organization. So the vendors will see it, but you as a third party won't see this the IP address for this event. But you will see the event and you can click on that and send that specific event to them. Because you may have a policy that says none of our vendors will use Telnet, for example. So of course, when you look at a portfolio, you can view the whole portfolio as well. So if you look at the whole portfolio, you can see a complete portfolio. You can look at spark graphs. You can also do some things around testing your portfolio. So one of the areas is incident management. So when WannaCry came out, I'll just take a glass of water. When WannaCry came out, the bank said to us, how do we identify who's got WannaCry? So we provided them with a filter which would identify any company in their portfolio that has WannaCry. This was really helpful because, of course, before they were doing that with an email sent out to all the companies saying, are you affected by WannaCry? Tell us how you're going to cope with that and how you're going to mitigate any risk. So here, for example, we're looking at a port which was used and exploited by WannaCry for a vulnerability which is double pulsar, which was exploited by WannaCry. And finally, looking at the complete list of companies that have WannaCry in my portfolio. So you can see from an incident management perspective, you're able to very quickly identify those companies that could be affected by an incident. So if you look at the total vendor life cycle, and I mentioned to you just to see this screen here, this is how you can send a report specifically to a company. We call it EVA, Enable Vendor Access, but you can send them a link and they'll get 2 weeks free access to the platform. So they can go in, see specifically what the issue was and remediate that. So, and of course, so looking at vendor onboarding, continuous monitoring, because it's a daily updated rating you can set alerts for. Incident response, where there's a specific incident that occurs that you want to quickly isolate those companies that could be affected. And of course, we talked about offboarding, where you can set alerts with companies retaining data. So that was a very quick whistle tour around the type of platform for cybersecurity ratings and how it can be used. In summary, for ourselves, just about BitSight. So BitSight, we are the largest in the world for cybersecurity ratings at the moment. We have about 1,000 customers. I told you we actually are rating 110,000 companies currently. We had about 500 a week rather. We have about 12 million domains and about 25,000 users on the platform at the moment. That's it. That's a quick whistle top of cybersecurity ratings and how they're being used, and a use case around vendor risk management, which, as I said, is the biggest area of growth for us at the moment. Thank you.
Now, let's correlate where we're up to and wind up this session and move to something of great benefit to yourselves. Firstly, in terms of what we're doing, I want to introduce you to a couple of concepts which I want to move forward. One of them is that as events director, I am looking for venues for hosting future events. You can see we've got a good partnership with PWC. We also have with EY. I am looking for to bring Deloitte and KPMG into this. So are you from Deloitte or KPMG, is my question. Is anyone here from Deloitte or KPMG? Okay, fine. Let me have a word with you, or please come and see me afterwards, because I want to find out if hosting ISACA London chapter events would be of interest to other Big Four companies. But not only to Big Four companies, because as you probably know, we also ran events last year at other places, such as Protiviti and Grant Thornton. Now, my remit is to fill 10 slots through the year, from September through till next June, for you. We take time off in July on holidays, we get our buckets and spades, and we run off and find nice beaches and all those sort of things. Maybe. But I need to fill slots from September through till June. That's what I'm looking at the moment. I filled 5 of them already, more or less instantly. So if you would like your organisation to be considered in terms of that, you'll need to provide a venue for at least 100 people, but come and see me, let's talk. The next thing that I'd like to just ask you about is, as far as our activities are concerned, we have a lot of places to go. There's a wealth of information out there. For example, who went to InfoSec? And the answer is a whole load of people over there, 1 or 2 people over there, and you seem to have missed out over here. I guess you were working in the office. But InfoSec had a huge number of exhibitors, of course. To my mind, it's getting too big. But the point is that the world of cybersecurity is exploding like crazy. My question to you is, did you find any particular presentations, presenters, companies of particular interest at InfoSec? Now, there are a lot of particulars in there. Come and tell me those particulars and share some of those likes with me. Another one. Up in Edinburgh, we had Eurocax, which is an ISACA conference. Who was there? Okay, I am interested in finding out the same thing. What did you find of particular interest at Eurocax that we could bring down to London and that we could share with all the good people here? So please come and see me and tell me about that too. We've got 2 symbols of success here, thanks to Ellis. And what I'd like to just explore with you is there are a lot of things happening, again, in the security area. So what I'm starting to put forward within the ISACA board is a grouping which I will term CISMIC, CISM Informal Community, which would share thoughts, bodies of knowledge, expertise relating to the CISM function. It's obviously one of the crowns of the ISACA portfolio, so we want to start making use of that. Also, the expertise of CISOs as they move forward into today, through today's world into tomorrow's. So many challenges. Want to start benefiting from that. If you have ideas about that, or you are a CISO yourself, please come and see me. I'd like to capture some details from you. Okay, that's a lot of things to talk to me about. Now, something for you. Thank you very much for being part of this great audience. And please join me in thanking our 3 presenters, Joey, Deanne, and what's your name, young man? I'm just looking up your rating here. And James, please, please thank me in welcome. Please welcome.
Join me.
Oh, I don't know. Look, let's give them a great big clap.